We're here today with Brother James Jones. Thank you for being with us, Brother Jones. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, when were you saved, and could you give us your testimony?
Yes, Brother Caleb. I was saved at the approximate age of 11 to 12. I can't even remember exactly how old I was. I know where I was at the Pleasant View Baptist Church in Clinton, Tennessee, atop Black Oak Ridge, a church that my parents had attended for many years. We were having a service. My afternoon was already planned of what the fellows I ran around with as boys would do in the afternoons. And I suppose, I just put this in my recent book I'm writing, the farthest thing from my mind was getting saved. Never even thought about it. Of course, I had gone to church all my life. I had seen people saved. I knew what it meant to be saved, I suppose, as well as 11 or 12-year-old boy could know. But when the preacher preached and the good Lord began to deal with my heart about my sinful condition, of course, always a boy that age, mamas and grandmas and aunts are going to talk about what a good little boy he is. But I wasn't a good little boy. And the Lord showed me what a sinner I was. And so the preacher had said, anyone who wants to talk to me about being saved, I want you to stay behind. And so when the congregation was dismissed, people left out on either side of me, before and behind me, but the Lord just had a hold of my heart. And so that day I remained. The preacher came back, talked to me. I gave my heart and soul to Christ. Now that's been over 60 years ago, and it's still holding good.
Yes, sir. Amen. When were you called to preach?
I was called to preach about 6 months before my 30th birthday. That's when the Lord started dealing with me. I worked for Mamba Engineering Company, and I was a line estimator, pole line. I would travel from city to city looking at jobs. And the Lord began to deal with my heart on one of those trips I was making. I talked to my pastor a little bit about it afterwards. I never did before. But anyway, my wife was the only one that knew anything about it. And I told her I thought the Lord was dealing with me about preaching. And unbeknown to me, she sent away to Dr. Oliver Green, because I listened to him all the time on the radio, and ordered a set of his hardback books. And he sent those books to her. She wrote a letter saying, we would love for you to pray for my husband because he listened to you preach. We have a lot of confidence in you. And he believes the Lord's calling him to preach, but he just wants to be sure. And so Dr. Green sent all of his hardback books at that time, and on top of the books in the box was a 187 King James Bible. And so my wife never told me anything about that until after I was confident that the Lord had called me to preach. For 6 months, I prayed, sought the Lord, asked him to do things, and everything seemingly like the Lord, I asked the Lord to do, he did. Maybe not exactly the way that I said it, but the end results were there. And so I still was somewhat, I guess, apprehensive, because I had known preachers that had said the Lord called them to preach, and they either didn't preach or they preached a while and quit. And so I had to be sure, because I knew, being closely associated with my pastor at that time, visiting with him, talking with him. I was also teaching the young adult Bible class. And I knew from listening to him and the situation of the church that I was going to have to be concretely convinced that the Lord was calling me to preach, because I would have problems just like he or any other pastor was having. And only the definite call of God upon my life would keep me, and I knew that. And so for 6 months, Brother Caleb, as I said, I drove a lot. I would pray many times the whole trip. It'd be an hour, hour and a half long, just begging God to let me know, promising him, if he would let me know beyond any shadow of a doubt, that I would never run from the calling. All I wanted to know was for sure. And God took the scriptures through the preaching of my pastor and convinced me beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was to preach. And I was already 30 years of age by this time, because my birthday was in the early part of July, and I announced my calling the last part of July. And so I was 30 years old at the time, and the good Lord convinced me, and I said I would go, and I've been trying ever since. I'm in my 48th year now.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your service. And what preachers have been a help in your life that you mentioned?
Well, let me approach it like this.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of preachers alive today that I'm friends with. And those men have encouraged me a great deal. A lot of preachers are alive today that we know one another. We are acquainted. And I think when it came to defending one another and their ministry, as much as we know about one another, that we would do. And they have encouraged me, but not like somehow. Some have just really encouraged me in writing, encouraged me in studying, encouraged me by inviting me to preach in their churches, and there's just scores of them, really. And so I could not really start mentioning those, because I'm going to miss some who's meant so much to me. So let me just tell the ones of days gone by, in the early days of my ministry at Titusville, Florida, and here at Harriman. The first one was a fellow by the name of Joe Lawlathan. He lived in Orlando. And that man saw in me something I did not see. And there was another fellow lived in Cocoa Beach. His name was Jack Wright. Now, you've never met these guys, because both of them have been dead for years, but they really helped me and encouraged me. These men, and the reason I'm saying that, using these two men especially, this was before I was ever called to preach of the Lord. Now, some people tried to call me, but I would not do that, because I knew better.
Yes, sir.
No matter what anybody said, and I had some things, it's humorous, so I don't want to get into that, said to me about preaching, but I knew that would not work. I had to know that God was calling me. And I am convinced, as I said earlier. But these two men, see, the pastor that we had at the church had resigned. The church had a 30-minute broadcast on Sunday morning. And so they asked me, the church did. I was the young adult Bible teacher. And so would I do the radio broadcast? And I said, I'll give a Bible lesson. They said, well, that's good. We just don't want to lose that spot because a lot of churches wanted it at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. A lot of churches wanted that, and they knew if they gave it up, they'd never get it back. And so I told them I would, and so I started doing that. And that's when some of these fellas that I just mentioned were listening to our broadcast and hearing me, and they thought by all means I ought to be preaching. Well, I would have been if the Lord had called me. And so then sometime after this, we got another pastor, and he was there a year before I ever announced my calling to preach. But I knew beyond any shadow of doubt by 2 messages that my pastor preached that I was to be a preacher. And so never was any question in my mind what I'd be. I'd be a pastor. And I've prayed about a mission field, evangelism, what have you, but pastor, that's always been what I know the Lord wanted me to do. And so that's what I've tried to do. But then later on, there was this Dr. Gordon Carpenter. I mentioned him in my books. I mentioned him in my preaching. He probably did more to me after I was preaching and more for me after I was preaching than any other one man. Because of his godly life, his godly stand, he didn't care if everybody lined up against him. He was going to stand for the truth. That helped me so much, Brother Caleb. Because even good people, honest people, people who are trying to live right are not going to always line up with everything the book says. But this man did. And he told all kind of stories that happened to him in his ministry. And can I tell just one?
Yes, sir. Good.
He said when he was pastoring out west, some of the men of the church wanted to get rid of him. And I know they did because of the truth that man stood for. And so they made it up among themselves. One fella was going to make the motion, and then the other fella was going to second it. And so one said, I'll make the motion. You say, okay, I will. And so they had their next business meeting. It was somewhat of an open forum type business meeting. And so Brother Carpenter said, is there any more business to come before the church tonight? Well, this one fellow stood up and said, I make a motion, we fire the preacher. And so Dr. Carpenter said, all right, there's a motion on the floor that we fire the preacher. Is there a second to that motion? And he said you could hear a pin drop. Nobody said anything. So the fellow who was to make the second, as we would say, chickened out. I don't think that was his term, but anyway, he didn't do it. And so he said, there is a motion on the floor to fire the preacher. Is there a second to this motion? He said again, it was as quiet as a pin drop. He waited a few seconds. Nothing was said. He said, all right, motion dies for lack of second. Next item of business. And he went, that's the kind of fellow he was. Well, this fellow that had got with these other men and said, I want you to I'm going to make the motion, and you're going to second it. Right, okay. Well, the man that stood up to make the motion the next week, his wife got killed in a car wreck. And the man that was supposed to make the second the motion, he died of a heart attack within a month. So I don't know. The things like, he told us so many stories that happened to him, and I know they're true. He was just unreal. And that man did so much to me that no matter what happens, who's for you or who's against you, you stand what that book says. And I've tried to do that. I've failed, I'm sure, in many ways, but I've tried to do that, Brother Caleb. And so he had such an influence on my life. And then I guess the next man, now all these men have been dead for years, was Dr. John McCormick. If you've heard me preach much, you've heard me bring him into the sermon too. And the reason for Dr. John McCormick, he taught several years at Tennessee Temple. He's a brilliant man. Probably the best Bible teacher I ever heard. Wow. And so we had him in our church, I know at least for 3 Bible conferences. But in all his preaching and knowledge and prestige, if you want to call it that, he had time for a young pastor. Mm-hmm. And it not only when he was at our church, but if he was at Calvary Baptist in Kingston, he had just as much time for me there as he did here. So those kind of men really helped me so much to get on my feet and get started. And then there's, just as I said, scores of men today. That's been such a help and encouragement to me. And in fact, if I'm anything at all, and I put this in my latest book, if I'm anything at all, I'm not on my own. It's been because of these other men whom God has put into my life. And of course, my precious wife.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you. And the next question is, what authors and books have been a help to you?
There we go again. I looked around my library. I was getting some of the books, looking at them and trying to do my best from memory. Let me do that, because there's no way that I could. I've got, a lot of books and a lot of current authors, but the ones I'm going to use are those who've been gone a while. And I guess among the Puritan writers, Thomas Watson would be my pick of all of them. Okay. And then, of course, Charles Spurgeon, and if you'll have a Calvinist, John Gill. He's a great author. You just have to spit out some things, right. But he loves that book, and he knew it, and so I liked him. And Guy King. Oh, yes. Guy King's a terrific author. If you find anything written by him, be sure and get George B. Duncan. And he was a Keswick speaker. Well, I think Guy King was too. Okay. And Griffith Thomas. G. Campbell Morgan. I really love reading behind G. Campbell Morgan. But perhaps the set of books that I have studied more than anyone else as a single author would be Matthew Henry.
Oh, okay.
And my wife bought me, as I said, I was teaching a young adult Bible class in Titusville, Florida. She sent me, or bought me, 1968, a set of Matthew Henry commentary for Christmas. Wow. And I've still got them in my library, still use them. And I really liked him. And of course, you got James Fawcett and Brown. Okay. I really, Jameson, Fawcett and Brown. I really like him. Okay. Albert Barnes, his notes. I know that's not all, because for example, when I wrote my commentary on Ruth, I read 30 works on Ruth.
Wow. That's a lot.
When I was starting, and by the time I finished, I'd written 30 different works on Ruth. So, it's kind of hard, but I think those have helped me as much as anything, especially when you come to practical holiness. You just can't improve on Matthew Henry. Albert Barnes is very good too. And Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, they stay with the book as much as any author I guess I've got in my library, so I like them. And so, is that enough?
Yes, sir.
Okay, there's many others, but those are the ones that just comes to mind that I love reading. Now, this one, Herbert Lockyer, he has the All series.
Yes, sir.
Now, I've used him many times. In fact, every book I've written, I've used him somewhere. Because he covers so many things, and they're just all the prayers, all the parables, all the men, all the women, and all the holy days, and things like that. Divine names, and so he is very thorough. I really enjoy his work, and he's helped me a great deal. Okay.
That's great. Yes, sir. And next question we have is, what advice would you give to young preachers starting their ministry today?
Well, I guess there's a lot of older preachers that would give the advice of staying on your knees and staying in the book. And because we live in a day, and Caleb, you're entering into it, and I've seen a great deal of it, that we've about arrived at a place that whatever works is what you use for your ministry. Mm-hmm. But we got to follow the Bible.
Yes, sir.
That's what we've got, because this is the book in finality that God is going to judge us by, what he has said in his word. And so that is my advice. And then I would give you 4 things to watch. They're easy to remember. First of all, watch females. Okay? There's something a lot of times about preachers, I don't know what it is, and I've talked to so many of them that's related to me story after story after story of things that's happened to them. And so you've got females, be careful about them. Number 2, be careful about flattery. It disturbs me when I hear a young preacher talking about how the Lord used him and what all God had done through his preaching and how many people had come by and told him how they enjoyed it. That scares me. A young preacher, there are a lot of things he ought to pray that God will help him to retain. But there's some things he better let go in one ear and out the other, and not stay in his mind, or he'll get puffed up as he's something he isn't. When a man thinketh himself to be something when he is nothing, okay, he deceiveth himself. Okay, so females and flattery, finances. Make sure you keep your bills paid. If a preacher won't pay his bills, I wouldn't stick my head out the door to hear him preach.
Yes.
And number 4 is friends. Be careful about your friends. Friends mean well, but they can sure lead you astray. I've had many talk to me about doing things that I did not feel the Lord wanted our church to get involved in. But it was the best thing in the world, Some of these fellows were real close to me. And so just let that book be your guide and the Holy Spirit speak to your heart. So those 4 things, okay?
Yes, sir. And next question is, what's the greatest move of God you've ever seen?
I've thought much about that. We had a couple of meetings in Mexico. Brother Ronnie Jones and I were preaching each night. And I think I preached first this particular night, and then Brother Jones preached after me. I can't remember, but I believe that's the way it was. It's been a long time ago, but the Lord just moved. I cannot remember how many people were saved. It's just a normal meeting seemed like, but the Lord just moved. And then again, once at Brother Rollins' camp meeting, Brother Rollins was a stickler when it came to time. You know, the dining hall would always have a meal prepared around 12 o'clock, no later than 12:30. But we had a meeting that morning, and that meeting went till 2 or 2:30.
Wow.
And never did break. The Lord was moving, and people were getting right. The biggest thing were people getting right one with another, walking across aisles, and it was just that was a great meeting. And then one more was at Ricky Gravely's church. We had a meeting one morning there. It was just, perhaps that's the greatest move of God upon me that I've ever experienced. And I don't know why. I was just preaching, and it just, bam, he just showed up and just began to move and work, and there were people worshiping, there were people rejoicing. I know one person got saved in that meeting, but it was just a mighty, I don't know how to explain it. Just God just seemed to permeate the whole building, and seemed that everybody in the building was touched in some way and moved. And God really manifested himself and encouraged his people in a great way.
Wow. Okay. And this is one of the questions I mentioned a few minutes ago before we started, but do you have any advice for marriage? I'm getting married soon, so.
Well, I'm happy for you, Caleb. I prayed for you. I really have. You're a fine young man, and you need a good woman. And so the dear lady you told me about, I have met her. I know her parents. They're fine, godly people, and I am really happy for you. But
thank you.
she consented, and you consented, or whatever, to get together, follow the Lord. And I know that was a concern for you, because you talked to me about it in a meeting. We were together somewhere, and you talked to me about it. And every man needs a good woman. That's what makes him. My wife and I have been married 55 years this past April. So we're closer now to 56 than we are 55. And a lot of people have let me say it like this. A lot of people are married, but they don't have a marriage. That's the difference. Sandra and I have a marriage. And the Lord really has blessed me greatly. As I said earlier, if I'm anything, these men have played the role, but more than anybody, she has helped me. She was an ideal pastor's wife. I could just talk for a long time about this, but you're wanting advice about marriage. Well, the scriptures give the way that it will work perfectly if both parties abide by it. And you have to realize Paul is talking about an ideal situation.
Right.
A lot of men wants their wife to be in subjection to them, so they, in a sense, can lord over them. But they've got a greater responsibility than she has, because they are to love their wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it.
Right.
And so marriage will work if it conforms to God's plan and instructions concerning it. So the husband is to love his wife. That's not always an easy thing to do, but love in your heart from the Lord will make it happen. And I've said this in my messages I preach to the home or on the home, that a man can love his wife with all his heart. He can love the church that God put him over with all his heart. And he can love the Lord with all his heart. Somehow God created us so that we could get everything in order and still love him with all of our heart. And then I would, of course, I know your dad's a pastor, great preacher, so I'm sure you've heard all of these things that I'm saying. Maybe everybody hasn't, but I'm sure you have. But how that you need to build that marriage on the Lord. Let him be the center. Let him be the cause of the decisions that you make. Not necessarily what you want, or even necessarily what she wants, but what the Lord wants. And God is so gracious and so merciful, and he wants you to love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself to her. In fact, it's commanded of us in the scripture. And we can do that. And as we're doing that, we are bringing glory to God because we are abiding in his word. And then the wife, she is to be in subjection to her own husband. In fact, and I've said this before and I believe it, that the husband is the only man, when she's married, that she is to be submitted to. Many women who work outside the home will be more submitted to their boss than they are the husband. Mm-hmm. Well, that's cheating him, and that is wrong. And of course, I'll probably get in trouble right here, but I would say it anywhere I was. Right. And a lot of pastors expect that wife of that man to be in subjection to them. She is as far as his pastoral authority is concerned, but not in the home. Right. The husband is the head of the wife, and he is the head of the home. And so the woman is to be in submission to her husband. Now, if a husband's loving his wife as Christ loved the church, she's in submission to him. That's ideal. Right. And that will work. That does not mean you won't have problems, because you're going to have them. But as I've counseled people who are going to get married, as well, those that I'm marrying anyway, that when the problems come up and the fusses and quarrels and all of that, it's rather hard to fuss on your knees. So if both of you on your knees praying, God can work anything out. There is no such thing as an unproblematic marriage. There's going to be problems, but God can help you if you'll look to him and trust him. I've been in situations in my life, and I'm sure my wife has in hers too, that only the Lord could bring us through that, because of any of us get our feelings hurt. We shouldn't, but we do. But the Lord is the answer to it all. And if we build our home up on him, and we want what he wants out of our home more than anything else, that'll work. Be good to your wife.
Yes,
amen.
Sir. I will.
Go the limit. Go the limit. And then beyond, okay?
Okay.
And love her, be good to her, be there for her.
Right. Yes, sir.
If you still have to have a couple of nights a week out with the boys, then I would suggest you don't get married.
That's good advice.
I married my wife because I loved her. I did not know if she liked to fish, but she did. She was my fishing partner.
Okay.
When I started deer hunting, she liked to deer hunt. She's my deer hunting. I'd rather go with her as anybody. I loved her. I loved being around her. It's still that way.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
And before we close, was there any parting comments you had or remarks?
I guess not. I hope I know I've not covered enough, because after this is over, I'm gonna think of 1,000 things I should have said. But I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate you and appreciate your ministry, getting the books out. Peter Cartwright was a tremendous evangelist. I mean, God was with that man. Now, he didn't let any grass grow. I mean, he kept it close. He walked the line. Great evangelist. God used him mightily, and God was with him. But he made this statement. He said, I do not know which has done the best good or the most good, my preaching or my distribution of books.
Wow.
So I appreciate you as a young man, what you're doing. I pray God will be with you and bless you. And I know you're going to keep the right kind of material out there.
Right, yes, sir.
To read the right Bible.
Definitely.
If you change Bibles on me, I'm going to break fellowship with you, okay? But you're not going to do that.
I break fellowship with myself.
And so you just hang in there and stay with it. And there'll be a lot of people probably don't appreciate what you're doing as much as they should, but stay with it.
Yes,
And you can get material into people. It is hard to find good reading material. You most of the time have to get used books, and because so many people are leaving the Bible, and I just don't like reading that stuff.
Right. Yes, sir. Well, thank you for being with us today.
Yes, sir.
That's it. God bless you.